Thank you, Gina. My name is Chris. If I haven't met you yet, it's a pleasure to welcome you here to St. Mark's as we continue our series looking at the second coming of Jesus, working through the parables and the teachings of Jesus in Matthew 24 and 25. I want to ask you as we begin, do you ever feel trapped by the fear of letting someone down? Whether it's a parent or a spouse or a friend or a boss, if someone asks you to do something, but you don't really want to. But the problem with not wanting to do it is you know what they want you to do and you're able to do it. And you know who they are. And you know the impact that it would have on them if you let them down. Because no one wants to hurt their dad. No one wants to hurt their wife by letting them down. I remember a few years ago, I was a youth group leader at a different church, and every week at the end of youth group, we knew the drill. The loungers would go over here, the tables folded up over there, the plates would go back in the kitchen and we'd wash them up. And every week, everyone helped. It was really great. But there'd always be one or two people, the same people, who kind of scrape by on the bare minimum. They'd take a plate and add it to the pile in the kitchen, and then they'd somehow end up sitting on the couch for 45 minutes while everyone else still helped. You see, they did enough to be seen to be helping, but not enough to actually help. They didn't want to get into trouble. So they always made sure that they were seen moving a plate into the kitchen so they wouldn't get in trouble, but they always had an excuse. They would always say, oh, it's late on a Friday night, I'm tired, I haven't had a chance to catch up yet, and so they scraped by. You see, the thing is, they knew what to do, they knew all the tasks, and they knew their pastor. They knew how much it would hurt them if they didn't do anything. And so they did all that they could to both do nothing on the one hand, and to not let them down on the other. And I want you to hold that thought, because I think that's actually similar to what's going on in our passage today. And unlike youth group leaders, where there wasn't really any significant consequence for them if they let someone down, there is genuine significance if we're afraid of letting God down. And so today, we're going to look through this passage, and we're going to explore God's good gift to us through Jesus in verses 14 to 15. We're going to look at our responses to those gifts from verses 16 to 18, and finally, Jesus' judgment on those gifts from verses 19 to 30. And this will be the launch pad into helping us think more about what I've described, the fear of letting God down. And so firstly, the good gifts of God. So verses 14 and 15, they show us a few things, and so please have it open in front of you as I read it out once more. Again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. And so firstly, this helps us place this parable amongst the context of all the parables around it. It's clearly about Jesus' return because the master's going on a journey. And if you were listening to what Gina read to us, we know that the master returns. You see, it's not an expected permanent departure, but the master is going, here's some money while I go on a journey and I will come back. It's the same linkage of thinking about Jesus' second coming. And so we know he is coming back and we need to live in light of that. We also are able to see that the master, from what we know of the rest of the Bible, is Jesus. And that Jesus, the master, in these verses, gives his people what belongs to him, his wealth. And in the parable, this takes the place of bags of gold. But this is a parable which uses imagery. And so here it's actually probably not literal bags of gold, whether it's, or a sack of diamonds. It's not physical human wealth. But it's actually, I think it's likely referring to our own personal gifts and abilities. And I think this is similar to what Paul says in Romans 12, verses 6 to 7, where he says, Having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, let us use them. If it is prophecy, in proportion to our faith. If service, in our serving. The one who teaches, in his teaching. Jesus is the one who gives gifts, and these gifts vary, but they are all good gifts from Jesus. It's also worth noting that these gifts were not all the same size, were they? There was 5, there was 2, and there was 1. But what's important here, I think, actually isn't the size of the gifts. It's not the fact that one gets 5 and another gets 1. It's actually the way in which they use it. And I think we see that when we look a little further down to verses 21 and 23, when Jesus gives the response, the judgment on those gifts, where he says, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness." It's the same response to both the servant who used his 5 talents or 5 bags of gold and the servant who used their 2 bags of gold. They get the same response. And this is significant. I think it would actually be the same for the 1 bag of gold person as well, if they had been a good and faithful servant and used it instead of burying it in the ground. You see, the point is not everyone has been entrusted with the same amount, but that is not a cause for jealousy. Because at the end of the day, if we are faithful with what Jesus has given us, no matter how large or small, he will give us the same response at our judgment. He also says that he gives us our gifts according to our abilities. That is, he does not give us more than we can use or handle. And that is a great blessing as well. And so the overall point here in verses 14 and 15 is that Jesus is the good God who gives gifts. He is the owner and the distributor according to his will, and we are just merely the recipients. And so it can be easy for us, I think, to sometimes forget that the things we are given are not of our own merit or worth, but they are given out of God's generosity. Because he is the only creator and sustainer of this world, and all we have is from him. Whether it is lots of wealth or not very much, whether it is lots of skills or not very many, whether we have lots of relationships and people we care about or not very many, all these things are from Jesus. And so we ought not to be caught up in comparing what we have to others or being jealous about that. We ought to thank him for what he's given us and whether we can see those gifts or not. And so that's the first part of our passage. The second is verses 16 to 18, and it is our response to God's gift. So read with me. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who had received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. There are very clearly 2 responses given. The first 2 servants put the money to work, and they gain more. The second, he buries it. It's quite stark and quite noticeably different. But I also want you to think about something. We know that the second response, burying it and hiding it, is bad because of the judgment that Jesus gives later on in our passage. But if we didn't have that, if we just took this out of context, would it still be bad? On face value, he hasn't lost any money. Sure, he hasn't gained any, but he hasn't lost any. It wasn't a bad investment. If I were to invest in something and don't lose value on it, it's certainly not a win, but it's also not a loss. But I also want you to realize that is not at all what is going on here. Because even before the judgment, even before Jesus tells him that he has done the wrong thing, the servant knows that he has done the wrong thing. Jump down with me to verses 24 and 25, where the servant gives his response. He says, Master, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you. I want to ask you, what is a surefire way to know that someone knows they've done the wrong thing? How can you tell instantly that someone knows they're in the wrong? It's if they begin by justifying their actions before doing anything else. I'm sure many parents in the room are familiar with the fact that if a kid starts off by trying to justify their actions, they know that they've done the wrong thing. His native response is not to admit anything, but to try and vindicate himself and his actions. He knows that they are poor actions. Otherwise, they wouldn't need to be justified. The first and the second servants, on the other hand, well, they just say, here's what you gave me, here's what I did with it. It's not actually about the return on investment at all. It's actually not about the fact that they've brought 5 bags of gold back or 2 bags of gold or nothing. It's actually about the servant, their heart, their response, and what they do with what has been entrusted to them. Because there are 2 responses to the gifts that God has given. You can be faithful with what you've been given and use it, or you can be fearful, untrusting, and bury it. So we will look at these responses in the parable and how they translate to us in our context shortly. But before that, I think it's worth exploring the reality of the judgment that follows on these 2 outcomes. So this is point 3, Jesus' judgment. And over the last few weeks, we've been looking at the reality that Jesus is coming back, and that when Jesus comes back, he will return as Lord and Judge, and we will all be held to account. And we need to know that, and we need to be constantly reminded of that. And in this parable, the reality of that coming judgment is shown quite clearly here in verse 19, where it says, "After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them." Jesus is returning, and he will settle accounts with all, those who believe and those who don't. And so the servants who acted faithfully with what they were given by God, the first 2 servants, they were able to stand before Jesus at the judgment throne, and they were able to demonstrate their faith through their actions. And they were rewarded in response. Isn't that what we all want to hear? To hear Jesus say the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant." That is the goal for all of us in life, isn't it? It's incredibly positive, isn't it? The recognition from Jesus. And it's in fact the positive outcome of things. It doesn't stop just here being recognized as a good and faithful servant. Look down with me to verse 29 as well. For it says, whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. And we'll talk about the negative aspect shortly. But the positive aspect in verse 29 is one of hope. We need to remember that what we have will be given more. But this is not in the context of financial wealth. This is in the context of final judgment when we're looking about Jesus' return. It's also in the context of what God has given us. I think a similar principle, which has helped me to understand this passage a bit more, came from Proverbs chapter 9, verse 9, which says, "Give instruction to a wise man, and he shall be still wiser. Teach a righteous man, and he will increase in learning." So it's actually giving to what has, and it will become more. It's faithfulness provides more blessing, is the principle that's actually at work here in this passage. And so that's the positive side of Jesus' judgment. It is a goal for us all to seek, to have the outcome of being a good and faithful servant. But the negative side of the judgment is just as real as the positive. Hell is real and is terrifying. The outcome in verse 28 is that what they have will be taken to them, and in verse 30, they will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Jesus is constantly reminding his people in chapters 24 and 25 of Matthew that the outcome of negative judgment is real, that hell is real. And in this parable, and what we're going to look at next week with the parable of the sheep and the goats, is there are people who think they have faith, but they don't. And that is terrifying, and we'll look at that more next week. So Jesus is the one who judges. And how does Jesus judge? Well, we know that from our Bible that judgment and salvation is not from our works, but is from our faith alone. It is not what we have done, but the judgment here in our passage has some relationship to what we've done. So look with me as we try and understand that connection. So let's look at this pattern in the judgment that Jesus gives to each. It's a bit small, unfortunately. Sorry about that. Let me read it out. So, first dot point on each side, is that Jesus judges their character. He says whether it's good and faithful or whether it's wicked and lazy, the first thing to be judged is character. The second is their responses, their actions, which is you have been faithful with a few things compared to you should have done this, this, and this. You should have put the money on deposit with the bankers so that when I returned, I would have received it with interest. Remember that these people are all meant to be believers. They're all people who are servants of the master. And verses 24 and 26 remind us of that. See, the wicked servant, in what he says that he knows exactly who God is and knows his character and still chooses to act in opposition to God. His actions condemn him, just as his character condemns him, and that leads to the outcome of the judgment, which is either come and share your master's happiness in the positive outcome, or take away the bag of gold from him and throw them outside. It is stark, and it is going to happen. So, we've looked through this parable. That's what it says. We know what it means and what it is showing. It is that the good God who gives gifts, knowing who our God is, Jesus, we as in return can choose to use those gifts how he would like us to be good and faithful. Or we can choose to do our own thing. And we know that when Jesus returns, we will all be judged on the way in which we responded to him. So we know that this parable is telling us clearly that we ought to be good and faithful servants who know our God and who follow him in response. But as we look towards applying this, it is right that we think about the two responses seen in this parable. The third servant who acts out of fear and uncertainty, or those who act out of faith. So, what actually motivated the third servant to act the way they did, to bury and hide the gift? And I've already mentioned this, and I'll show you again. It comes from verse 24 and 25, where it says, "The man who had received 1 bag of gold came and he said, 'Master, I know that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you.'" So what can we gather from these verses? It seems that the servant knows who Jesus is. They said, "I knew that you were this." And when Jesus responds down in verse 26, Jesus affirms that, actually. It seems that this person does know God. And that might be a bit confusing in some ways. We see the description there on the screen, that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. That description of Jesus seems in contrast to the good Jesus who's given generously good gifts to the first and second servants. And so it might be that the servant has no idea who Jesus is and Jesus is being facetious. It might be that the servant focuses on a particular aspect of God and forgets about his good generosity. Because we know our good God. We know that on the one hand, he is the God of justice, of righteousness, the God who punishes sin. But we also know that he is a God of mercy and forgiveness, who forgives us our sin when we come to him in repentance and trust. It might be that this servant has focused on one aspect of him to the neglect of the other. Regardless of how this fits together, from the passage it seems clear to me that the servant knows Jesus and that Jesus affirms that the servant is correct in this knowledge. We also can see that the servant knew what Jesus wanted of them. The servant knew that Jesus wanted them to be faithful in their actions. And we know that this servant was not faithful. They did not do it. And in the beginning of verse 25, towards the end of what's on the screen, the servant says that they are motivated by fear, that they are afraid. We don't really know why. It may have been that the servant saw the other servants putting it to work and didn't think they'd be able to do it to the same skill level and make back what they had. Maybe they were afraid of failing, of trying to put the money to work and failing. But I think what's actually happening is that they were afraid of letting God down. Because I think failure motivates us to indecision and inaction. And I think it's that fear that has motivated this servant. Because fear of failure can look like many things. In this parable, it looks like inaction. He's frozen like a deer in headlights. He knows the right thing to do, but he is unable to do it, so just does nothing. But it may instead, fear of letting someone down may look like seeking to overachieve, to do too much, to be so afraid of letting God down that we're suddenly unsure of our own salvation, and we seek to do all these things to earn assurance of that because we're afraid of letting him down, to be a bad Christian. It's kind of weird, isn't it, how the same response, we're afraid of letting God down, could result in inaction and doing nothing because we're afraid of doing it wrong, or it might look like doing too much because we're afraid we're not doing enough. And I want to be careful here when talking about doing actions, because I want to remind us of what we talked about earlier, in that it's not actually about the actions themselves, but it's the character, it's the why of it, it's the why we do things. And it's the fear of failure in our faith, of not being good enough, that we need to be wary of. It's the fear of not being good enough to share the gospel with our friends or family. It's the fear of not being comfortable, being afraid of getting it wrong if we try and use what God has given us. It's not about how many people you share the gospel with. It's not about how hospitable you are and how lovely you are as a person. It's not about whether you do this or whether you do that. It's about the why. Because knowing God and acting in response to him is what we are called to do. And we know that. And acting in spite of that is what we should not do. And that's a real and true warning for us. And our parable shows us the outcome, doesn't it? That at final judgment, those of us who know who God is and act otherwise will be judged. So do not be like the final servant. Do not be stalled to inaction because you're unsure what to do. Do not be afraid that you're not doing enough and so end up doing nothing. Trust God. Act in faith. That's what the first two servants do, and it's what we should do as well. We ought to be people who know God and act in response to him out of faith. And this does look different for each of us. And the reason it does is that God has given us different gifts and abilities. He's given us different access to skills and talents, or resources and things that we can use for his glory. We need to use our own gifts and talents to serve our great God. As I mentioned earlier, it is not meant to be a cause for jealousy that some of us have different gifts or different abilities at using the same gifts. It is always a cause for rejoicing that our God has given us good gifts. Our parable shows us that no matter how much we have, whether it's 5 bags or 2 bags, if we use it for his glory, he will congratulate us and say, "Well done, good and faithful servant." In fact, he goes on to say, "You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things." Whether it's big or small, God views it as small, which is strange considering the great generosity that he has given us, isn't it? For those of us who know him, who know the generosity of God, he has given us not only skills and abilities or resources, he's given us life. He's given us salvation. He's given us a hope of eternal future in a place of no mourning or fear or pain. I'm not sure about you, but that is not little. That is huge. And we need to remember God's generosity and act in response. Not because we're obligated to, not because we won't make it to heaven without it. Our salvation is not dependent upon that. No, we do it. We act in our faith because we know who our God is and we love him. And so we act in response. That is our takeaway for today. We need to see and know what God has given us. And we need to use that for his glory. We need to be good and faithful servants because we know the outcome if we don't.